Structure debates another 6.0 introduction 6. Structure debates another 6.0 introduction 6.1 unit objective 62 debate over betterment of women's position 63 problem of the minorities 64 social versus political democracy 65 valid question. Affirmative action 6. 5. 1 the Gandhi Ambedkar debate 6.6 debates over the nature of the Indian state 6. 1 civil state and civil rights 6.7 summary 6.8 key terms 6.9 answers to check your progress 6. 10 questions and exercises 6.11 further reading 6.0 introduction gender history has emerged as one of the most important genres in the last few decades as a part of subaltern history. Gender studies got enriched with works that looked at different aspects of social, political and cultural life of women. The question of political safeguards for minorities was referred to the Advisory Committee on Fundamental Rights, Minorities, Tribal and Excluded Areas in the Constituent Assembly whose creation had been mandated by the Cabinet Mission Plan of the 16th of May 1946. This unit will discuss such debates in the Indian History 6. 1 unit objectives. After going through this unit, you will be able to analyze the debates over the betterment of women, discuss the various problems of the minorities and the legal measures taken, discuss the Dalit question and the need for affirmative action, explain the various debates over the nature of the Indian state 6. 2. Debate over betterment of women's position. The Hindu social reformers in the 19th century advocated for women's education and struggled for the betterment of the social condition of women. By the end of the 19th century, the social reform programs began to decline and women's participation in public politics was increasingly visible. Parth Chatterjee in his famous thesis reflected that the nationalist leaders wished to protect their households, private space, from the intervention of the colonial rulers. This was the reason for the nationalist resolution of the women's question. Below we will discuss some aspects of women's participation in public life and in the nationalized struggle. Women and social reform. The women's question was very much a part of the 19th century. Indian Renaissance and the coming of modernity. The pitiful plight of women inside the household space invited the social reformers to execute serious changes. The need of modernity was very evident. The new Indian educated middle class and elite men needed educated wives who could be their ideal partners. The nature of family life was changing fast. Women were lagging behind to keep pace with the demands of the modern household. Women had to fit in the new social life that was penetrating the world of the middle class. Early 19th century social reformers were concerned with the social injustice on women. Dipesh Chakraborty in an essay has shown that the feeling of daya or compassion drove them to think about bringing some changes in women's lives. The term daya was used for numerous times in the tracts written by Vidyasagar and other contemporary social thinkers. Ladamani's argument located at another pole of the debate. But before discussing her theses, we will have a brief discussion on the social reforms. Ramahan Roy, son of a Brahmin Zaminder hailing from Hooghly district of Bengal, began to raise his voice on various social atrocities on women, among which the custom of sati, immolation of Hindu ladies alive in the funeral pyre of their husband, was the most important. He faced vehement opposition from the orthodox fraction of the society. In 1829, Lord Bentinck passed the Sati Act pursued by Ramahan. The act put a stop to the practice, though protracted incidents of sati went on for decades in the nooks and corners of the country. The second social reform that agitated the society was the passing of the Widow Remarriage Act of 1856. Ashwat Chandra Vidyasagar was the pioneer in this movement. The pitiable plight of the young widows, who were subjected to lifelong celibacy, appealed to his conscience. Ladamani shifted from the argument on daya and showed the entire debate on sati or widow remarriage was based on the Hindu scriptures. To convince the orthodox opposition, Ramahan, Vidyasagar and their supporters directly cited texts from Smriti, Shruti and the Upanishad. Their opponents too used the scriptures to argue in favor of sati or against widow remarriage. The debate interpretation of the scriptures. While one group was quoting from one cluster of verses to find support for the new reforms, the other was using another belt to critique them. In ancient times these debates were prevalent, and the same was enacted in the 19th century. The figure of the woman was nowhere present at the debate. It turned out to be a debate on correct interpretation of the sources. The Vajra Mahila or lady of the new age had to embody the changes that were coming up in the socio-cultural life of Indians. The image of the lady had to be constructed in a new way. Tanika Sarkar in her book Hindu Wife, Hindu Nation has argued that the Hindu housewife became synonymous to the Hindu nation. The imaginary of the nation merged with that of the wife. Abanindranath Tagore in his famous painting of Bharat Mata in the early 20th century had depicted the nation as a Hindu lady. The country was imagined as the mother exploited by foreign rule. The lady of the new era, who was distinct from the British lady and also from the lower class woman, epitomized the Hindu nation. Judith Walsh's research on the female magazines of the late 19th and early 20th centuries showed that a constant process was going on to prepare the housewives to manage the household of this new era. The familial and social roles of women were changing fast. Nationalist struggles subsumed women since the beginning of the 20th century. Gandhian movement inspired large numbers of them to participate in public demonstrations. Women and the nationalist struggle. The first organizations for women were founded by men belonging to the new religious reform associations. The Brahmo Samaj in Bengal and the Prarthana Samaj in Maharashtra initiated the foundations of women's associations. Pandita Ramabai presided over the Arya Mahila Samaj established by her husband Justice Renade. In 1887 the Bharata Mahila Parishad or the Ladies' Social Conference was formed. Within the Parsi community the major organization for women's social work was the Stri Zardosti Mandal, Parsi Women's Circle. Begum Amian Nisa formed the Anjuman-e-Court in Islam, the Muslim Women's Association. In the Punjab, women from all leading communities began to participate in the All India Women's Conference. Later women themselves began to form their own associations. Sarala Devi Chaudhurani was one of the leading women who took such initiatives. Mahila Samitis sprang up in various parts of the country. The main issues discussed were female education, child marriage, observance of purdah, women's status in family care, the most important women's association, the All India Women's Conference. Main concern was women's education. There turned out to be a debate on the scriptures. It was a twofold examination and first meeting of the conference was attended by 87 members from the local reception committee, 58 delegates from local conferences and over 2,000 observers, both men and women. The first president was Maharani Chimnabai Sahib Geekwad of Baroda. They demanded a different kind of men's. Another issue the conference dealt with was the question of child marriage. They took serious steps to put an end to the evil practice. Women participated in large numbers in the nationalist struggle. Gandhi's call brought man off them outside home. The wave of non-cooperation movement, the charkha or spinning wheel and the use of khadi appealed to women of all classes and castes. They participated in large numbers in the Gandhian movement. Madhu Kishore indicated how the charkha enabled Gandhi to raise simple, ordinary women to the status of fellow workers for a common cause along with Gandhi. Other leaders of Congress became vocal about women's rights. Middle-class leaders of the Congress had proposed that women, with property and other qualifications, be given the right to vote in the expanded electorate proposed by the reforms of 1919. In 1918, Sarojini Naidu spoke on behalf of women's suffrage at the special session of Congress held in Bombay. The British didn't agree with this view and argued that while most men of India were still deprived of formal education, women should not enter the realm of politics, so women joined in large numbers in the civil disobedience movement. In Bombay, women's picketing and demonstration from 1930 to 1932 got press attention. Sarojini Naidu presided over the Rashtriya Stri Sangha. It stated its goals as Swaraj and women's emancipation. Though Gandhi refused to take women to the Dandi March, large number of women in the rural areas prepared salt on their own. Calcutta women made and sold salt, picketed cloth and liquor shops, preached the value of kada, and took processions into the streets. Women's colleges participated in the revolutionary struggles. The Mahila Rashtriya Sangha, the first formal organization to mobilize women for political work, began in 1928. Latika Ghosh founded it with the inspiration of Subhash Chandra Bose. The organization argued that women's liberation was an integral part of the nation's struggle for freedom. Also, the Neri Satyagraha Samiti was formed in 1929. Women joined in large numbers the revolutionary organizations and directly took part in the terrorist activities. Female students of schools and colleges secretly got involved in revolutionary actions without the knowledge of their families. Bina Das, a young college student, fired a pistol at Governor Jackson. Bina and her elder sister Kalyani, Surama Mitra and Kamala Das Gupta formed the Chhatri Sangha, Association for Female Students, for discussing political matters. Students of the Beaton College were imprisoned for street demonstrations. Women joined in large numbers in the Chittagong Armorial of 1930 led by Suraj Senator Shanti and Suniti. Two schoolgirls from Camilla shot Magistrate Stevens to death on Soon. December 14, 1931. In September, Pritila Dewadada, a Chittagong schoolgirl, led 15 men in a raid on the Chittagong Club. By 1933, most women pollutionaries were taken to prison. Women's participation in revolutionary and nationalist politics should be viewed in two ways. 1. Terms of what it meant for the nationalist movement. 2. How these actions shaped the women's movement. The mutually interdependent processes helped the questions on women's rights to come forward. Sarala Devi Chaudhurani posed the question, how can we attain rights, and answered, we must force menfolk to concede to our demands and at the same time carry on propaganda among ourselves. In the years following the civil disobedience movement, participation of women in the professional life increased. New sacraments were demanded to protect women's rights within the family and outside. Women of Hindu, Muslim and other communities came forward with their demands. Freedom and independence arrived with new hopes and promises for womenfolk. Check your progress. 1. When was the Act of Sati passed? 2. When and where did the All India Women's Conference first meet? 6.3 Problem of the minorities. Partha Chatterjee stated that majority and minority are just states of mind. These ideas are social impositions. They don't just indicate numbers. In India, the term minority connotes the religious groups that have less number of followers compared to the more widespread Hindu religion. India was partitioned on communal lines in 1947. Pakistan was declared a Muslim state and large numbers of Muslims shifted to the new territory spread on both sides of India. The eastern part gained independence in 1971 and got the new name, Bangladesh. India was declared a secular sovereign state. But in the territory of independent India, followers of the Hindu religion appeared to be the majority religious group and the Muslims and other groups the minorities. Though the government of India is always careful to maintain peace and harmony, communal tension often becomes issue in different parts of India. Not only communal issues, but the questions of minority rights and social improvement often come to the fore. In this section we will learn how the minority problem was handled by the Indian government since independence. Colonial segregation in the colonial period. Reform movements went on in Hindu and Muslim societies separately but on parallel lines. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, worried about the backwardness of the Muslims, prescribed modern education for them. The Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College in Aligarh helped the Muslim youth come self-forward and participate in modern politics. Muslim aristocracy in India conspired against them, the outcome of which was the Revolt of 1857. Khan, an English-educated aristocrat, convinced the British on the baselessness of such reception. With his inspiration, the Muslim society in India imbibed modern literature and philosophy and felt the need to eradicate the evils from their society. Since the late 18th century, Muslim identity consciousness developed separately from the Hindus. Viceroy Dufferin referred to the Muslims in 1888 as a nation of 50 millions. The term nation is noticeable here. The formation of separate identity consciousness among the Hindus and Muslims ultimately led to the partition of India in 1947. Historians often blame the census or the practice of head counts by the British administrators, which began in 1871. The census introduced separate columns for different religious communities, and it gave birth to a competition to increase the number of members under their respective categories. Hindus and Muslims vied to gather people below their religious banners. The Arya Samaj and the Islamic Tablighi sect both worked in rural North India to convert the population to their respective faiths. Yogendra Sikand has shown us how religious leaders of the two communities were destroying the culture of shared faith. Sandria Freitag has pointed out how riots broke out between the two communities over the issue of cow protection. The United Provinces saw a series of fights in the 1890s. In Maharashtra, Bal Gangadhar Tilak organized the Ganapati festival and instructed the Hindus to stay away from Muslim festivals. The leaders of the Indian national movement often took Hindu stance in public. Protection by the Constitution. In the post-independence era, we can see that the Indian state dealt with the problem of minorities in diplomatic ways. The Constitution of India promised liberty, equality and the right to justice to all Indian citizens. Rajiv Bhargava has pointed out that the four structural issues addressed by the Constitution were rights, citizenship, democracy and minority. The Indian Constitution grants equal rights to all its citizens and collective rights to communities. It also recognizes no distinction of caste, class, religion, gender. In the British period, separate laws were codified for the Hindus and the Muslims following the scriptures of each religious group. Personal law played a crucial role in forming religious identities. The Constituent Assembly recognized four communities that could have their separate personal law: Muslims, Christians, Parsis and Hindus. In matters that come under the jurisdiction of personal laws, members of the four communities as Indian citizens have the right to abide by the Uniform Civil Code or their personal law. The section Fundamental Rights extends legal protection to all religious groups. Everyone in the Indian territory has the right to practice their respective religions. But the Constitution does not equate religion with freedom of conscience. It also does not treat the freedom of religion as an absolute one. The state can impose control if it anticipates any dangerous outcome of any religious expression. The Indian state maintains the formal separation of religion and politics. The state distances itself from all religions. It professes to protect all religions and maintain neutrality and equal distance from them. This is the basis of secularism of the Indian state. The word secular was added to the preamble of the Indian Constitution in 1976, 29 years after the Constitution had been in force. Article 44 of the Indian Constitution mandates the state to endeavour to secure for the citizens a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India. The underlying assumption is that a uniform code will create a sense of Indianness and strengthen national unity. This was one step forward to create the post-independence Indian nation. Though this was not always enforceable by law, the fundamental rights of all communities and sects are recognised by the Constitution. Personal laws often tend to divide citizens on religious lines. But at the same time, these laws ensure moral justice of all citizens. Personal laws challenge the Indian legal system to treat all citizens fairly and to handle difference in a responsible and responsive manner, apart from the legal plurality. The personal laws often help women to exercise their rights. The Shah Bano case of 1970s and 1980s is one instance of intense debate over personal law. The legal battleground, the personal laws of the minority communities remained untouched by the Indian Constitution. No government dared to interfere in the matter. The matter was debated in the Constituent Assembly. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and Law Minister B.R. Ambedkar considered the Uniform Code to be an instrument of modernization, secularization and national unity. But in the disturbed political scenario of post-partition India, they didn't want to invite any communal agitation. So they decided to reform Hindu personal law first and proposed a comprehensive Hindu civil code. On the other hand, leaders of the Muslim community to introduce important changes in the application of the Sharia. The legislations of 1937 and 1939 granted Muslim women the right to divorce their husbands under certain conditions. The law assured them protection from the arbitrary use of the power law divorce by husbands. However, marriage in Islam is considered a contract and it is dissoluble. These legal measures did not make it clear whether the Muslim lady had the right to claim alimony or not. Legal reforms again and again brought the minority issue to the fore. The Hindu Code Bill invited some opposition. Those who didn't conform to the Hindu Civil Code demanded the Uniform Civil Code. The opponents of the Hindu Civil Code complained that only one community, the Hindus, was subject to reform. They pointed out that the Muslims were allowed to follow the personal laws prescribed in Islam, in context of the Shah Bano case of 1985. That allowed the divorced Muslim woman to demand alimony from her husband, hurt the religious sentiments of the Orthodox Muslims. The Islamic associations complained that their instructor they were not ready to accept the judgment given by the Hindu judges of the Uniform Code of Criminal Procedure in order to seek alimony from her lawyer husband who had divorced her after over 50 years of matrimony. Got transformed into a battle between certain sections of the majority and the minority communities and provided the ground for strong political mobilization along communal lines. The personal laws provoked long debates. The majority community urged for the Uniform Code. They posed as secular and nationalists, but religious laws of the respective communities were always in vogue. Civil rights activists argued that the personal laws only strengthened the authority of the male members of the minority communities. They questioned the capacity of these laws to protect a helpless woman turned out from her home at a fragile age. Veena Das observed that when a community's right to its own culture includes the right to legally govern its members in the sphere of the family, what recourse is left for the vulnerable women or children who may be oppressed by the pathologies of the family for redress? Such women and children are in most cases fall into the trap of community rules. The legal measures for the minority in independent India created a paradox. On one hand, the personal laws often failed to protect the natural rights of the weaker and vulnerable sections of the community, but on the other, it was argued against the implementation of a uniform civil code that such forceful standardization would erase the diversity of India. It would be wrong to dismiss all the legal measures that derived from respective religious treaties. Hence, the legal reforms of the minorities remained a paradox, a dilemma, a two-pronged weapon. Legal scholars propose a balanced application of the personal law so that they can meet the needs of modernity. Flavia Agnes, the civil lawyer, demonstrated that Muslim women and a concerned and sensitive judiciary has carved out a space for the protection of women's rights. The Muslim Women, Protection of Rights on Divorce, Act was passed in 1986. It endowed the Muslim women with the right to demand alimony for their husbands within the IDA period. It is often argued that this law provided better protection to minority women than Article 25 of the Uniform Criminal Code. Check your progress 3. State the mandate of Article 44 of the Indian Constitution 4. State one example of intense debate over personal law 6. 4. Social versus political democracy. The expression of social and political democracy comes up most prominently in the scheme of the universal adult suffrage. The voting rights to all adults irrespective of their caste, class, creed, educational and social status was one step forward. ICB-1PF-11B wards implementing both social and political right of people. A democratic government should be formed of the people, by the people, for the people. The basic principle of a democratic system is that it gives people the right to elect their leader. In the Western world, the voting right for women and slaves were accepted much later. In India, however, universal adult suffrage was implemented by the Constitution. The primary purpose of the Indian Constitution was to keep it distinct from the British Constitution. Independent India had to carve out a unique identity. Indian government was supposed to provide social justice to all classes of people. Political right, aka voting right, was a step towards that. It is believed that only careful implementation of one's political right can make one properly empowered. The way towards political democracy. Gandhi stated in 1922 that Indians would have to set their own agenda to rule their country. They should not mimic the Europeans and rely on the concessions made by them. Swearage can never be a free gift by one nation to another. It is a treasure to be purchased with a nation's best blood. It will cease to be a gift when we have paid dearly for it. Gandhi further stated that the foreign rulers never granted any rights or implemented any political reforms in India. The Indians had to fight tooth and nail to snatch their share of rights. The British administrators and later the neo-imperialist scholars claimed that the British in India implemented many modern democratic measures during the course of their 200-year rule. The reforms and constitutional initiatives of 1861, 1892, 1909, 1919 and 1935 are often looked at as forward steps towards democracy and social justice. For example, The elected principle was first introduced by the British in the Indian Council's Act of 1892, but the Congress leaders considered this a small grant unable to meet the huge demands for democratic political system. The nationalist leaders kept on demanding political rights to participate in the administration and governments. The issue of adult franchise was one of the grounds of debate between the British and the Indian nationalist leaders. The British practice in India was far from being democratic. The Imperial or Central Legislative Council was a totally nominated body of a maximum of 17 members with an official majority and a few token Indian members. The Congress demanded the implementation of male adult franchise, i.e. vote by ballot. They wanted power to the legislative councils to vote on the finance bills. The Act of 1892 introduced the system of election, but they were still a minority with little power. Demands for more and more democratic measures created pressure on the British. In 1895, the Constitution of India Bill was passed, which was also known as the Home Rule Bill. The authorship of the bill is unknown, though it was generally believed that the joint effort of Annie Besant and Bal Gangadhar Tilak was the inspiration behind it. The bill spoke in the language of Western philosophy and democratic system and put forth the demands of basic human rights such as freedom of expression, equality before the law, right to be and be citizens of India. Even if the provisions were there on paper, the British government didn't implement them properly. The Government of India Act of 1935 increased some of the measures, though practical application of the provisions was still a long-standing issue. The Indian Constitution, however, borrowed heavily from the Bill of 1935. This bill was a result of long-term resistance and many sacrifices on the part of the nationalist leaders. The framers of the Constitution showed respect to the efforts of the freedom fighters. Annie Besant, Tej Bahadur Sapru, V.S. Srinivas Sastry played a leading role to pass the Commonwealth of India Bill in the British Parliament in December 1925. The bill got wide support from all sections of Indians. It specified in clear terms that India shall be placed on an equal footing with the self-governing dominions. Motilal Nehru introduced a resolution on the 8th of February 1924 in the Central Legislative Assembly which asked the government to summon, at an early date, the Representative Round Table Conference to recommend, with due regard to the protection of the rights and interests of important minorities, the scheme of a constitution for India. The Simon Commission of 1927 represented the rage of the British. It was an all-white commission and everywhere in India protest demos broke out against the draconian proposals it made. It wished to curtail the participation of Indians in the system of governance. The Nehru Report of the 10th of August 1928 laid special emphasis on securing fundamental human rights for the people of India. These included the right to the freedom of conscience and the free profession and practice of religion, the right of free expression of opinion, as well as the right to assemble peaceably and without arms, and to form associations or unions, equal rights for men and women, and the right to free elementary education. From the list, it is clear that the nationalist leaders were aware of the elements of both social and political democracy. The demand for a constituent assembly was repeated frequently after 1934. The Congress won majorities in 7 out of 11 provinces in the 193,637 elections and decided to form the ministries. On the 17th of September 1937, the resolution recommending replacement of the Government of India Act 1935 by a constitution framed by a constituent assembly was introduced in the Central Legislative Assembly. It was introduced by the Congress leader S. Satai Murty, following the outbreak of the Second World War. The Congress ministries resigned in protest that the British government denied to do any discussion with them regarding the changing internal situation in India due to war. At this moment, the legislative assemblies asserted that India should be regarded as an independent nation entitled to frame her own constitution. The leaders consented on the subject that the way to democratic swaraj rested only through a properly constituted assembly. The ultimate freedom of India came after a series of struggles. The Constituent Assembly was formed after lots of bargain, and on the 9th of December 1946 it began its first session, with India becoming independent on the 15th of August 1947. To frame the constitution as well as making ordinary laws. The Indian Constitution and social justice. The Constitution declared India as a sovereign democratic republic and promised to secure to all her citizens justice, social, economic and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith and worship, equality of status and opportunity. The Congress government, under the leadership of Nehru, decided on a system of parliamentary democracy, a Westminster style of government for the new, modern India. The Lok Sabha was to be composed of representatives elected on the basis of universal adult franchise. The provision of universal adult franchise made a major break with the colonial past. It was a firm step towards providing social and political right to all. The decision was no doubt momentous. It established equality of all citizens at least at one level. And it is significant that in India women never had to fight for right to vote. The preamble to the Constitution assures certain basic principles. Justice comes first in the list, followed by liberty, equality, fraternity and dignity of the individual. The Congress demanded adult suffrage since the 1920s. A few voices advocated confining of adult suffrage to elections to the panchayats at the village level. They proposed indirect elections to higher level bodies. But the majority of voices demanded direct elections by adult suffrage. It is considered a great achievement in a Brahmanical, upper caste dominated, mallow-oriented, elitist, largely illiterate society. Even chauvinistic comments began to pour into as people got excited with this universal right to vote. Ancient scriptures were cited to prove that adult franchise was not a modern-day phenomenon in India. T. Prakashan spoke about an inscription on a 1,000-year-old Kanjivaram temple which talked of an election held with leaves as ballot papers and pots as ballot boxes. The Hindi scholar Raghuvira claimed that ancient India was the originator of the republican system of government, and spread this system to the other parts of the world. Alavi Krishnaswamy AI, a foremost constitutional expert who played a crucial role in the framing of the constitution, stated, "The Assembly has adopted the principle of adult franchise with an abundant faith in the common man and the ultimate success of democratic rule." Austin has called direct election by adult suffrage the gong, the single note, whose reverberations might awaken or at least stir sleeping India. Till the end of the British rule, the franchise was restricted by property, educational, and other qualifications to approximately 15% of the country's population. Historian K.M. Panikkar once said that adult suffrage has social implications far beyond its political significance. Many social groups previously unaware of their strength and barely touched by the political changes that had taken place, suddenly realized that they were in a position to wield power. This statement clearly explains the social role of universal adult franchise along constituent assembly became a sovereign body and took over the responsibility with its political significance. Social and political democracy thus merged together. Voting right brings all classes, castes, religious groups, communities and both men and women on the street on a particular day. What can be a better public spectacle of the world's largest democracy? Check your progress. 5. What is the basic principle of democratic system? 6. Name the leaders who played a leading role to pass the Commonwealth of India Bill 6.5. Dalit question. Affirmative action. We will discuss the debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar in the next section. While Gandhi wanted to eradicate untouchability from India by invoking conscience of the upper caste Hindus, the latter denied to accept the very basis of Hinduism itself. Ambedkar wanted a total annihilation of caste. He prescribed some methods through which this dismissal of caste could be achieved. Ambedkar's proposals for caste mobility were implemented in independent India. The main thrust of his debate was that the untouchable menial castes should be protected by affirmative action and thus would be assimilated to the mainstream caste Hindus over the passage of time. To implement this agenda, a certain percentage of seats were to be reserved in government educational institutions and offices. Below we will discuss the various aspects of the Dalit question in independent India. Ambedkar and his worldview. According to Nehru, caste was the symbol and embodiment of exclusiveness among the Hindus. It had no place left in the social organization of today. Nehru was convinced that caste was an archaic and parochial institution that had no relevance in modernity. It was a part and parcel of the traditional culture. He expected this hierarchical system to die gradually with the growth of science, technology and modern knowledge, but as a member of the upper caste, Nehru missed to see internal realities of Hindu society. He ignored the violence of caste system that crippled the society slowly from inside. It was Ambedkar who made the Prime Minister aware about the never-ending evils of the caste system. Ambedkar took firm steps to convince Nehru on the special rights for the Dalit community. Ambedkar argued that caste belonged to the domain of the social and the political. The root cause of the socio-economic backwardness of members of untouchable communities. Ambedkar and Nehru shared their vision of liberal democracy posited on individual rights. Both of them agreed upon the idea that education and employment would empower the members of the lower caste communities. Both believed that only would implement necessary measures to eradicate the social evil. They were in favor of the uniform application of the Constitution and for implementing measures of modernization. However, two Lib and Democrats differed on their assessment of caste. Ambedkar always sought politic power for the Dalits, which he thought would empower them fast, but never following Gandhi. Thought caste system was an internal problem of Hinduism. Was against the politicization of the matter. Ambedkar turned the colonial legacy reservation for Dalits and members of backward classes in public employment into an instrument to fight social injustice and weapon of the weak. The Constitution declared the practice of untouchability to be illegal. At the same time, realizing that the situation in India was still very critical and the social equality was still an illusion, the designers of the Constitution arranged for some special privileges for the deprived castes. Some seats were reserved for them in the educational institutions and in public employment. This was the genesis of the much-debated reservation or compensatory discrimination, adopted as a temporary measure for 10 years. The idea was that this provision helped them upgrade their social status and they would acquire the capacity to compete with the upper castes. But in reality we can see that more and more groups have come forward to state claims on the grounds of reservation and backwardness, and the provision of reservation has been extended continually. For the subsequent period of 10 years, the question of affirmative action and the provision of reservation over the period of time have created a paradoxical situation. The very question recurred whether caste could be the yardstick for reservation. The notion of discrimination was frequently under scrutiny. It was thought that the reservation system would minimize discrimination and assure social justice. The legal order was supposed to implement equality, but it created a legal muddle. But in spite of these arguments, we can observe that the provision of reservation has enabled the Dalits and backward classes to come forward and get advantage of education and employment. Further, they could press for better privileges and discuss their plight in the public sphere. It has also allowed members of the privileged upper classes and castes to speak in terms of bourgeois equality and merit and question compensatory discrimination. They eventually argued that positive discrimination is a negative force that reinforces inequality. The question was now narrowed down to positive discrimination and compensatory discrimination. Constant debates went on the logic of reservation, but the fiercest battle that shook the country after independence was not on the issue of Dalit reservation but on backward class reservation. The category of the backward classes was vague since the beginning. The term backward was fluid and could be applied freely in various occasions. The idea of caste itself implied backwardness, and that's why several groups claimed backward status using this logic. The government's constant consideration of the category of backwardness created discontent in the upper caste groups. The parties fighting for Hindu rights came forward and launched protest demos against the government's step towards giving backward status to large number of communities. The debate over caste and discrimination did not only agitate the political and government sector, it raised social questions. Caste status ruled the ritual life of Indians. Discrimination and hierarchy was very much a part of religious practices while caste was so prevalent in social life. The idea of a secular Indian state was under scrutiny. The effect of caste on Indian democracy was debated seriously in the 1960s and 1970s after the appointment of the first Backward Classes Commission in 1953. A new era began in Lower East politics in North India. The government set up a commission to look into the matter of backward classes and gave it the responsibility to identify which castes were eligible to get the advantage of reservation. The commission took caste to be the most prominent criterion for backwardness, although not the only one. Its report presented to the Constituent Assembly in 1955 produced passionate debates and was never implemented. Christopher Jaffrolid has commented that though the instructions of the commission were not implemented immediately, it brought revolutionary changes in the lower caste movements in North India. Large number of castes asserted social justice and shared the stories of social discrimination they face in public sphere. Jaffrolid called it a silent revolution. In the political sphere, the revolution left prominent marks. Good number of lower caste members was elected to be the members of the parliament. In the state assemblies also their representation increased in an unprecedented scale. The mobilization of the lower castes in North India was accompanied by economic privileges like the Green Revolution in the Punjab during Indira Gandhi's regime. A class of wealthy middle peasants emerged and they fought for higher social status. Many peasant leaders entered the quota politics and carved out privileges for their respective communities. The 1977 elections in India was a result of mass lower caste mobilization in North India, though the government didn't stay for 5 years. They successfully set up an alternative to Congress in the center. Academic scholars did not conform to the view that caste should be only considered as a religious institution. They argued that caste was traditional and pertained to the domain of the religious cultural. Various definitions of discrimination and hierarchy were articulated. Some scholars argued that caste should be eradicated through social measures and caste issues should be kept aside from politics. The question came up whether caste was good or bad for Indian democracy. Aditya Nigam has shown how the presence of caste in politics gave birth to narrow sectional identities. This was often embarrassing for the leaders as the main purpose of a democratic system should be to transcend these boundaries of division. The Anti-Reservation Stance, his second round of caste movement and counter-movement took place in the 1980s and early 1990s. More and more lower castes and backward groups asserted space in the privileged institutions and in politics. The proponents of Hindu rights too raised their voice against these assertions. The immediate occasion is provided by the report of the Second Backward Classes Commission, widely known as the Mandal Commission, appointed by the Janata government in 1978. The commission was constituted only by lower caste members. They pointed out how caste system was the root cause of structural inequality and the principles stood behind the backwardness of other backward classes, OBS. It indicated the educational and social backwardness along with the poor financial status of his said castes. They proposed affirmative action for the OBCs on the same ground the Dalits were already entitled to various privileges. The objective of affirmative action was to give the OBCs access to power and not just to jobs. The Commission's report suggested a 27% reservation of seats for OBC students in all scientific, technical and professional institutions run by the central and state governments. The assertion of the Mandal Commission provoked serious riots against caste reservation all over the country. In Gujarat, the state government tried to implement the said reservation, but after serious anti-reservation riots, the government stepped back. The central government desisted from implementing the measures for long 10 years. The Janata Dal government, under the leadership of VP Singh, announced the adoption of appropriate steps for the implementation of the recommendations of the Mandal Commission towards the end of 1989. The Commission proposed quotas for the other backward classes in central and state governments, for private undertakings receiving financial aid from the government, and for all government universities and affiliated colleges. It supplemented constitutional reservations for scheduled castes and tribes set at 22.5% by introducing proportionate representation for backward castes for another 27%. Not include D in the earlier proviso and the provision, however, aroused severe protests in several places. On the 27th of September 1990, Rajiv Goswami, a student of Delhi University, set himself on fire by dousing his body with kerosene. The large-scale protests of the upper and middle castes were induced by the threat they faced in the sectors where they exercised monopoly privileges for decades. The language of protest used by Rajiv Goswami and the spectacle of his burnt body caused horror in the public sphere. The debates on caste discrimination and its political solution went on. It took more than 15 years for the government to implement reservation for the OBCs. The voice of Hindu fundamentalism became louder in the meanwhile. Protection of the causes of the Hindu upper castes became their primary agenda. The reservation system, the provisions for affirmation action and large-scale financial aids to the post-Minorinoy backward castes improved the social status and economic condition of the Dalis and other lower castes. But on the other hand, it caused the rise of the Hindu fundamentalist forces that played with the caste system in a different way. 6.5. 1. The Gandhi-Ambedkar debate. The good corpus of works has been produced in the last few decades on caste consciousness and caste movements in colonial India. These works, in general, traced the changing role of caste in social history and showed how caste became a major issue in the nationalist politics. Historians have shown how the fourfold Varna system of Vedic times evolved through ages and how it still controlled the Indian social system through the colonial times. Scholars and leaders like Fuel, Ambedkar, Piriya and Jajendranath Mandal questioned the caste structure of Hindu society and called for an annihilation of the entire caste system. Caste movements in various parts of the country intensified since the 1870s. The lower castes and untouchables launched protest movements against the authority of the upper castes and demanded rights and privileges in the sectors of education, government jobs, etc. Below is a summary of the caste movements in colonial India. Gandhi and Ambedkar. How they differed. The main argument of the depressed classes was that the untouchables and tribals were the original inhabitants of India, but it was they who were suppressed by the Aryans and were made to serve the upper castes. The lower castes often formed resistance by refusing to perform customary caste duties such as scavenging or carrying away dead animals. Besides, they fought for right to education and employment. They demanded a way out of Hinduism rather than absorption in it. In the 1930s, the untouchables coined a new term for them, Dalit, that means broken or oppressed, a term they believed was much more effective than Gandhi's Harijan. The Dalit community now prepared its agenda to participate in the nationalist struggle. Now it was up to them to decide who were to be their allies and who the enemies. And it was B.R. Ambedkar, popularly known as Babasaheb, who for the first time provided the Dalits with an ideology of Thayar Bhimrao Ramji. Ambedkar was born on the 14th of April 1891 in the garrison town of Mhau, military headquarters of war, in a Mahar family in service of the army. His family was the follower of Kavapanth, a syncretic ideology owing its origin to the Sant Kabir. Ambedkar graduated with a BA from Elphinstone College of Bombay and went to Columbia University and the London School of Economics for further studies. He was influenced by Western theories and began to write extensively on the evils of caste system in India. After coming back to India, he founded the first forum for the depressed classes in Nagpur in May 1920. Gandhi included the agenda to remove untouchability in the program of his non-own cooperation. ICA became hostile to him when he refused critique caste system. He realized that neither the British administration nor the Apurkists were sympathetic to the causes of the untouchables. He gradually made to be anti-Congress and anti-British since 1928 when the Simon Commission arrived. Ambedkar put forward his demand for separate representation of the depressed classes through elections would elect their candidate. He also sought safeguards for the depressed classes in education and employment in the public services of the state and the army, and rested on the necessity of protecting their civil rights. Ambedkar was invited to TEF First Round Table Conference to be held in London in December 1930, where he insisted that the first step to empower the depressed classes should be to endow them with political power. But it was in the Second Round Table Conference of 1931 in which direct clash broke out between Gandhi and Ambedkar. Ambedkar's demand for separate electorate for the depressed classes went completely against Gandhi's idea of the unity of Hindus. Gandhi proposed that the problem of untouchability needed to be solved with the change of heart on the part of the upper caste Hindus, an idea that appeared absurd to Ambedkar. In the concept of separate electorate, Gandhi saw a colonial ploy to divide India, and was very critical of Ambedkar. Ambedkar, on the other hand, claimed a radical departure from the very institution of Hinduism. Hinduism, he declared, had created a veritable chamber of horrors for the untouchables. Ambedkar's discontent towards Gandhi's opinion about caste was already well known. Ambedkar expressed his visions on Gandhian movement during the Vaikam Satyagraha in 1924 to 1925. In the first public meeting of the Bahiskrit Hitakani Sabha, Ambedkar made his agenda clear. He was not ready to submit to caste Hindu sympathies. He mobilized the untouchables to demand for their civil rights. Gandhi at that time was not aware of Ambedkar's identity or his political agenda. He treated the latter with minimal politeness. Ambedkar, scared and disillusioned, stepped out of the meeting after a scathing speech condemning the Congress and the famous statement Mahatmaji, I have no country. Gandhi and Ambedkar, how they compromise, said the second round table conference provided the space for their first public debate. Both Gandhi and Ambedkar spoke with emotion and eloquence. Ambedkar argued for political empowerment of the Dalits, but Gandhi insisted on reform and protection from above. He looked at the problem of untouchability as a problem of the self. He was unwilling to politicize caste relations. Gandhi stated that, I can understand the claims advanced by other minorities, but the claims advanced on behalf of the untouchables was the unkindest cut of all. Gandhi himself wanted to represent the untouchables. He thought Ambedkar was not yet fit to lead them. Ambedkar, on the other hand, condemned Gandhi's entire idea on untouchability, so he wished a radical departure from caste. A path-breaking idea he summarized in his famous treatise The Annihilation of Caste. The conference ended abruptly on a note of bitter disagreement. Ambedkar signed a pact with representatives of minority communities, the minorities Payko, even though he lost the support of the All India Depressed Classes Association MC Raja. The second representative of untouchables at the Round Table Conference took a path of compromise and entered in a pact with Munj, the president of the Hindu Mahasabha that advocated joint electorate on the basis of reserved seats for the untouchables. The British government endowed the depressed classes with separate quota of seats to be filled only by members belonging to the untouchable castes. Gandhi began his famous fast in protest of this agreement. Ambedkar has to enter a compromise. The Pune Pact on the 24th of September 1932 between Gandhi and Ambedkar replaced separate electorate by a joint electorate with a substantial increase in the number of reserved seats in legislative councils for candidates from untouchable castes. The Pune Pact invited diverse reaction from different quarters of leadership in India. The caste Hindus could not welcome it as it reduced the number of seats for them, but in general, the pact marked a new era in the socio-political history of India. Caste movements got new momentum and new leaderships emerged from various parts of India. Ambedkar founded his Independent Labour Party in 1936 to mobilize the poor and the untouchables on a broader basis than caste alone. He continued his attacks on the Congress leaders like Nehru for their secularist approach that refused to look at caste as a political problem. The Dalits claimed a separate identity under his able leadership. During the Quit India movement of 1942, the Congress tended to absorb Dalit politics. The results of the subsequent elections also went against the interest of the Dalits. Ambedkar's famous act of conversion to Buddhism in October 1956, just a month and a half before his death, declared his ultimate descent from Hinduism. Even after his death, Dalit politics continued in independent India through various trajectories and challenges. Check your progress. 7. What was the objective of affirmative action? 8. When was the Independent Labour Party formed? What was its objective? 6.6 Debates over the nature of the Indian state. The Congress government, under the aegis of Nehru, decided on a system of parliamentary democracy. Though it borrowed heavily from the parliamentary system of Britain, it never copied the British structure. The Indian Constitution acknowledged all the great constitutions of the world. The Federal Constitution of the United States of America too had an influence on the Indian federal democracy. India had to carve out her own political system out of the debris left by the British rule. The Central Legislative Council got transformed into a bicameral parliament with an upper house, Rajya Sabha, and a lower house, Lok Sabha. The Lok Sabha was composed of the representatives elected on the basis of universal adult suffrage. The leader of the majority party in the Lok Sabha was to become the Prime Minister and head the new government at the centre for a period of 5 years. Same pattern was to be followed in the federal states, where the bicameral legislative assemblies were to have elected representatives in the lower house, to be headed by chief ministers. Leaders of the respective parties that had won majorities in the states, the strong centre, the presidential system was retained with some alterations. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel and Rajendra Prasad, the first president of India, fought for implementing these measures. The president is the titular head of the state. He appoints governors as his representatives in each of the federal states. The president was to be elected by members of an electoral college composed of the elected members of both houses of parliament and elected members of the legislative assemblies in the states. The president has the sovereign right to dissolve the elected government at the centre and in the states in special cases of crisis and emergency. In independent India, in few cases, the president had to use his veto power to dissolve the government and implement his own rule, but that is generally considered a state of exception. The proclamation of India as a republic ended her allegiance to the British Crown, even though she continued to form a part of the British Commonwealth. The Constitution mandated for a complex system of fiscal federalism. It provided 3 areas of responsibility: union, state and concurrent. The centre retains the entire amount deriving from particular taxes, for instance customs duties and company taxes, but income taxes and excise duties it shares with the states. Some taxes like the estate duties go to the state exchequer. The state could levy and collect certain taxes on their own. These included land and property taxes, sales tax and duties on bottled liquor. The centre had full control over minerals and key industries, but in spite of this proportionate distribution of wealth, it is complained by many specialists that the Constitution showed a certain bias towards the rights of the Union of India and curbed the voice of the constituent states. It is said that it was the colonial power that imposed this centralizing tendency over Indian democracy. The unitary system was an inheritance from the colonial rule. Provincial politicians continued their struggle for the right of the states. They asked for a better share of tax revenues. A member from Orissa said once that the Constitution had so centralized power that I am afraid, due to its very weight, the centre is likely to break. A member from Mysore stated that it was a unitary rather than a federal constitution. K. Santharam of Madras, one of the most vibrant champions of states' rights, thought that the fiscal provisions would make the provinces beggars at the door of the centre, but members of the drafting committee of the Constitution vigorously defended a strong unitary centre. B.R. Ambedkar stated that he wanted a strong united centre much stronger than the centre we have created under the Government of India Act of 1935. Both the proponents of Hindu and Muslim fundamentalism supported a strong centre so that in time of communal tension the central government could take firm steps. A secular state, the Constitution declares India to be a sovereign, socialist, secular and democratic republic. The terms secular and socialist were added by the 42nd Amendment in 1976. In 1973, the Supreme Court implemented that the secular character of the Constitution was to be one of its basic features. Scholars and politicians debated a lot over the meaning of the term secular. Some argued that the idea was borrowed from Western concepts of democracy, but the term had an altogether different meaning there. In the West, the democratic system of governance was an outcome of the age-old struggle between the church and the state. As a result, the former was recognized as the religious institution, while the latter was endowed with the duties to guard people's rights in the non-religious sectors. Secular meant something that was not connected to religion, but in India the term secular was used against the term communal. The nationalist leaders waged war against the communal forces that wanted to use religion for political purposes and divide the emerging nation on the basis of religion. Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, the renowned scholar of Indian philosophy, who was the president of India from 1962 to 1967, stated that the idea of secularism was very much a part of Indian tradition. We hold that no religion should be given preferential status of unique distinction. No group of citizens shall arrogate to itself rights and privileges that it denies to others. No person should suffer any form of disability or discrimination because of his religion. Secularism is here defined as in accordance with the ancient religious tradition of India. The idea of a secular Indian state was often attacked and challenged by fundamentalist forces. A number of riots ravaged commerce of India in several instances. The demolition of the Babri Masjid of Ayodhya on the 6th of December 1992 aroused huge communal tension in all parts of the country. The riots in Gujarat in 2002 following the bombing of a bogie of the Sabarmati Express, which was full of Hindu religious men, posed a serious challenge to the ideals of secularism and democracy. But in spite of the protracted attacks on the idea of secular India, the concept got intellectual support from all over the world. The nature of the Indian state got integral to the concept of secularism. 1 civil state and civil rights formation of the Indian nation was a historical process. In the course of history, India had acquired some elements of common existence and consciousness. Despite over the centuries, the poet Rabindranath Tagore called it the unity of spirit. In ancient India, there were evidences of centralized rule and sense of unity. In the medieval era, the Mughals integrated various parts of India. Though narrow sectarian interests ravaged many comers of the Indian territory from time to time, it was the underlying sense of unity and camaraderie that remained. The anti-colonial struggle strengthened this feeling to a great extent, with the development of transport and communication. The nationalist leaders of various parts of the country could connect with each other and adopt a common agenda of action. A feeling of Indianness, had come into being, as testified by the currency of the concepts of Bharat Varsha and Hindustan. This idea of unity and diversity was the base of the civil state in independent India. Unity and diversity. India's complex diversity is legendary. Vincent Smith, the famous British historian, once called India an ethnic museum. It consists of a large number of linguistic, cultural and geographic economic zones. It has followers of different religions: Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Parsis, Buddhists and Jews, apart from tribals with myriad belief systems. In 1950, the Indian Constitution recognized 14 major languages, besides hundreds others. The 1961 census listed 1,549 languages as mother tongues. Nehru advocated for a forged unity while recognizing all diversities of the nooks and corners of India. He stated in 1951, "We have to remember always that India is a country with a variety of cultures, habits, customs and ways of living. It is very necessary, I think, for all of us to remember that this wonderful country of ours has infinite variety and there is absolutely no reason why we should try to regiment it after a single pattern. Indeed, that is ultimately impossible. Consequently, the consolidation of independent India was to occur around the concept of unity and diversity. Why diversity had a negative aspect too. It pulled the nation to various directions. It often led to threats of disintegration. At international level, it was often argued that only an authoritarian state could hold all the parts of a diverse nation together. The argument came to the fore that democracy and national integration were not compatible in the case of newly liberated and developing countries. The Indian architects of the Constitution, however, were determined to establish a civil state that would protect the right of all in spite of the vast diversity within the nation. Jury repeatedly warned his countrymen that in India any reversal of democratic methods might lead to disruption and violence. The constitutional structure established in 1950 encompassed the demands of diversity as well as the requirements of unity. The framers of the Constitution tried to balance the trends of decentralization and disintegration and of unity and integration. The Parliament stood as the epitome of centralization and unity. Asoka Mehta stated that the Indian Army and administrative services are also a force for forging national unity. These services are all India in character and sentiment, and all central services are non-political in nature. The army is a national force whose officers are recruited from all parts of the country. Further, the prominent leaders of independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, Maulana Azad, Rajendra Prasad, were not associated with any one region, language, religion, or caste. This was true of the opposition leaders such as Jayaprakash Narayan, J.B. Kripalani, Ramana Lohia, Syama Prasad Mukherjee, B.T. Ranadive and Ajay Ghosh. All the major post-1947 political parties, Socialist Party, Communist Party of India, Jansang and later the Swatantra Party, were all India in character and in their organisation and ideology. Though regional parties were fast coming to prominence, they too had their All India representatives. Two sets of rights on the basis of the idea of unity and diversity. The civil rights of the people were also determined. The Constitution includes a list of fundamental rights and directive principles. The first, a guarantee against encroachments by the state, and the second was a set of directives to the state to introduce reforms to make those rights effective. The former is considered more important than the latter. The people were granted civil liberties under the category fundamental rights. The Constitution broke away from the tradition of the colonial constitution. The British never granted rights to Indians. The framers of the Constitution produced the rights in written form. This was probably inspired by the gross violence of human rights all over the world. At international level, two rights were written down to keep clarity. Following the suppression of human rights in Germany, the Soviet Union, and other places, the Atlantic Charter and the United Nations Charter had been drawn up and the United Nations Human Rights Commission established. Minority rights were guarded, as has been mentioned earlier. The question that surfaced on fundamental rights was that how those rights would be implemented. There were some rights that could be granted immediately, like political rights, and some could be granted or implemented only over a period of time, like social and economic rights. As a solution, the concept was borrowed from the Irish Constitution. The socio-economic rights were placed under the directive principles of state policy that were not subject to immediate application. The concept of two varieties of rights derived from the SAPRI report of 1945. Many leaders found the system unjust, but the state had to follow a middle path to address the difficulties rising from categorizing the rights. The fundamental rights are divided into 7 parts: the right of equality, 10 EELS. He cares of the right of freedom, the right against exploitation, the right to freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, the right to property and the right to constitutional remedies. These rights were incorporated in Articles 12 to 35 of the Constitution. These rights protect all citizens from arbitrary state action. 3 of the articles protect the individual against the action of other private citizens. Article 17 abolishes untouchability. Article 15(2) says that no citizen shall suffer any disability in the use of shops, restaurants, wells, roads, and other public places on account of his religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. And Article 23 prohibits forced labor. A citizen whose fundamental right has been infringed or abridged can apply to the Supreme Court or High Court for justice. The directive principles, however, are not subject to judgment of the court. They are a bunch of guidelines and instructions. In many cases, conflict broke out due to diverse interpretations of the directive principles. The Constitution didn't want the fundamental rights and the directive principles to be read separately, but in practice confusion arose many times over their implementation. It is generally agreed that till 1971 the courts gave greater importance to the fundamental rights than to the directive principles, but that the 25 and 424 amendments in 1971 and 1976 brought in by Indira Gandhi gave precedence to the directive principles. Article 38 summarizes the purpose of the directive principles. The state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice, social, economic, and political, shall inform all the institutions of the national life. There is to be equal pay for equal work for men and women, and the health of workers, children and pregnant women is to be protected. Compulsory primary education to children and minimum wage for workers. The Constitution aimed at creating conditions for the building of an egalitarian society in which individual freedom would be secured. Narrow stated. The directive principles of state policy represent a dynamic move towards a certain objective. The fundamental rights represent something static, to preserve certain rights which exist. Both again are right. There is a certain conflict in the two approaches, not inherently, because that was not meant, I am quite sure. In some cases the judges themselves gave overlapping explanation of the two sets of rights. To put an end to this confusion, some important changes were made in 1951 in the Articles 15, 19 and 31, dealing with the fundamental rights of equality, freedom of expression, and property. These changes were an outcome of the suits that challenged the abolition of zamindari. In subsequent years as well, many important Supreme Court judgments as well as constitutional amendments continued to define and redefine our relationship between individual rights and social good. Between fundamental of Austin, who put it that the tension between the two sets of rights represents the classic dilemma of how to preserve individual freedom while promoting public good rights and directive principles. It would be good to conclude with the statement S. Check your progress 9. When were the terms secular and socialist added to the Constitution? 10. What are the 7 parts of fundamental rights? 6.7 Summary. Gender history has emerged as one of the most important genres in last few decades. As a part of subaltern history, gender studies got enriched with works that looked at different aspects of social, political and cultural life of women. The women's question was very new, ch a part of the 19th century India and Renaissance and the coming of modernity. The pitiful plight of women in Siddharth household space invited the social reformers to execute serious changes. The first organizations for women were founded by men belonging to semi-religious reform associations. The Brahmo Samaj in Bengal and the Prarthana Samaj in Maharashtra initiated the foundations of women's associations. Women participated in large numbers in the nationalist struggle. Gandhi's call brought many of them outside home. The wave of non-cooperation movement, the charkha or spinning wheel and the use of kadi led to women of all classes and castes. Women's participation in revolutionary and nationalist politics should be viewed in 2 ways. 1. In terms of what it meant for the nationalist movement. 2. How these actions shaped the women's movement. Partha Chatterjee stated that majority and minority are just states of mind. These ideas are social impositions. They don't just indicate numbers. In India, the term minority connotes the religious groups that have less number of followers compared to the more widespread Hindu religion. India was partitioned on communal lines in 1947. In the colonial period, reform movements went on in Hindu and Muslim societies separately but on parallel lines. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, worried about the backwardness of the Muslims, prescribed modern education for them. The personal laws of the minority communities remained untouched by the Indian constitution. No government dared to interfere in the matter. The matter was debated in the Constituent Assembly. The expression of social and political democracy comes up most prominently in the scheme of the universal adult suffrage. The voting rights to all adults irrespective of their caste, class, creed, educational and social status was one step forward towards implementing both social and political right of people. The issue of adult franchise was one of the grounds of debate between the British and the Indian nationalist leaders. The British practice in India was far from being democratic. The Imperial or Central Legislative Council was a totally nominated body of a maximum of 17 members with an official majority and a few token Indian members. The demand for a constituent assembly was repeated frequently after 1934. The Congress won majorities in 7 out of 11 provinces in the 193,637 elections and decided to form the ministries. On the 17th of September 1937, a resolution recommending replacement of The Government of India Act 1935 by a constitution framed by a constituent assembly was introduced in the Central Legislative Assembly. It was introduced by the Congress leader S. Satai Murthy. Ambedkar and Nehru shared their vision of liberal democracy posited on individual rights. Both of them agreed upon the idea that education and employment would empower the members of the lower caste communities. The debate over caste and discrimination did not only agitate the political and government sector, it raised social questions. Caste status ruled the ritual life of Indians. Discrimination and hierarchy was very much a part of religious practices. The assertion of the Mandal Commission provoked serious riots against caste reservation all over the country. In Gujarat, the state government tried to implement the said reservation, but after serious anti-reservation riots, the government stepped back. The main argument of the depressed classes was that the untouchables and tribals were the original inhabitants of India, but it was they who were suppressed by the Aryans and were made to serve the upper castes. The lower castes often formed resistance by refusing to perform customary caste duties such as scavenging or carrying away dead animals. Besides, they fought for right to education and employment. The Second Round Table Conference provided the space for their first public debate. Both Gandhi and Ambedkar spoke with emotion and eloquence. Ambedkar argued for political empowerment of the Dalits. The Congress government, under the aegis of Nehru, decided on a system of parliamentary democracy, though it borrowed heavily from the parliamentary system of Britain. It never copied the British structure. The Indian constitution acknowledged all the great constitutions of the world. 6. 8. The proclamation of India as a republic ended her allegiance to the British crown even though she continued to form a part of the British Commonwealth. The constitution mandated for a complex system of fiscal federalism. Key terms: Mahila Rashtriya Sangha. It was the first organisation established by India with the aim of engaging women in political activism. It was formed in Bengal Presidency, British India. In 1928 by Latika Bose upon the instigation of Subhash Chandra Bose, a prominent Indian nationalist leader. Sharia. It is a religious law forming part of the Islamic tradition. It is derived from the religious precepts of Islam, particularly the Quran and the Hadith. 6.9 Answers to check your progress. 1. In 1829 Lord Bentinck passed the Sati Act pursued by Ramahan. 2. All India Women's Conference, first met in Pune in January 1927. 3. Article 44 of the Indian Constitution mandates the state to endeavour to secure for the citizens a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India. 4. The Charbano case of 1970s and 1980s is one instance of intense devotee of a personal law. 5. The basic principle of a democratic system is that it gives people the right to elect their leader. 6. Annie Besant, Tej Bahadur Sapru, V.S. Srinivasa Sastry played a leading role to pass the Commonwealth of India Bill in the British Parliament in December 1925. 7. The objective of affirmative action was to give the OBCs access to power and not just to jobs. The minister objected to a 27% reservation of seats for OBC students in all scientific, technical and professional institutions run by the central and state governments. 8. Ambedkar founded his independent Labour Party in 1936 to mobilise Pepper and the untouchables on a broader basis than caste alone. 9. The terms secular and socialist were added by the 42 Amendment in 1976. 10. The fundamental rights are divided into 7 parts: the right of equality, the right of freedom, the right against exploitation, the right to freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, the right to property and the right to constitutional remedies.